people in the room. As you may have noticed, this session will be recorded if that's okay with you. If it's not, then please turn your cameras off. So firstly, why we brought you together today, just quickly.
Maybe good to note that it will only be recorded for internal purposes or also for publication.
Yeah. Sorry, did you say for both?
No, exactly. I was just checking in with you whether you is it for self-reference or is it for also for public?
I think it would be nice if we can use it publicly.
All right. Yeah.
Okay, so let's get started. We have a whole 2 hours, but I know time flies. So thanks all for joining us. Today we're talking about polarization in the Eastern European neighbourhood, and specifically the case of Georgia. And we also designed this session so that we can draw some conclusions that can feed into an ongoing discussion of a broader project, which is to develop policy implications and suggestions for programming in the future. So what do we want to do today? We want to talk about how polarization in Georgia has changed recently, particularly regarding the issues of rule of law and democracy, and how the social contract, which is a specific focus of the knowledge platform security rule of law at the moment, could offer a framework as to how to address those issues. And we're graciously being hosted by the Knowledge Platform Security Rule of Law today. Christian, you can see in the room, maybe you could just wave quickly. We'll be speaking to you later at the end. I hope you've all been able to look at the program, but what we're basically going to do is run through, the program. We're going to have some short presentations from Corneli, Levan, and Marco to frame our discussion, and then we'll hopefully be able to spend some decent amount of time actually talking about what the key questions are for today, which are the following two things. What's the mechanism that's currently increasing polarization? How does it explicitly affect issues of democracy and rule of law? And secondly, how can the lens of social contracts be applied to identify entry points for responses to these issues? All right, so I've already asked you about the recording, and if that's okay, if you do have questions, please just raise your hand rather than putting them in the chat, because I am terrible at keeping an eye on the chat. If you have links or extra information that you'd like to share with us that we might be able to use for this project for background information, please do put those links in the chat, and then we can pick them up at the end of the discussion. All right, so we have a bit of a tight schedule, so let's just keep moving on. Firstly, we have 3 speakers lined up for today. We shared a biography with the attendees beforehand, but if you 3 could just quickly say who you are and what your background is so that you've identified yourself. Corneli, perhaps you could start.
Oh, good morning. I'm Corneli Kakachi. I'm professor of political science at Tbilisi State University and the director of Georgia Institute of Politics.
Thank you very much. Levan, I can see you there as well.
Hello, I'm Levan Tsutskiridze. I'm director of Eastern European Center for Multi-Party Democracy. Yes, good to see all the familiar faces and the new ones too. So look forward.
Welcome. And Marco, finally.
Thank you, Amy. Yes, my name is Marco Mezze. I'm based in Rome. I'm actually a governance expert with the Food and Agriculture Organization, but I'm here because of the work I did last year on the social contract for the knowledge platform. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, so what we're going to do is we're going to have a brief introduction by Marco about the social contracts, and then we're going to move on to talking about Georgia specifically. So Marco, please, you could take us away.
Yes, I hope I will not blow you away. Let's see. Okay, I tried this before, so if it's right, you should be getting a view of my presentation, just a slide. Can you confirm that?
End of it.
Sorry?
We see the back end of it.
Okay, so this is
the other one.
right.
I mean, it works, but
Yeah, I shouldn't do this one. Okay. Sorry, go to the other one. Okay, so is this better?
perfect. Thanks.
Okay, they shifted position on my screen, so that's why they did a trick. They tricked me. Okay, yeah, I'll Amy, just a quick note to you. I know I have 10 minutes. I'm hoping that I will stick to the time. If I'm over time, please, if you the last 2 minutes you ring a bell for me, because then I will like in any case to talk about the last slide I have.
Yes.
So, because I think that's important.
I'll let you know 2 minutes beforehand.
Okay, that's great. So here we go. Yeah, first as an introduction, I mean, with Amy, we discussed about this idea of connecting the whole concept of the social contract to the work, I mean, to the issue of polarization in Georgia. And so the purpose of my short introduction is indeed to present to you a bit of the concept of the social contract, a bit of its background, and then to try to see how this concept has been developing during the last 15 years, so to speak, in terms of international policy and policy support, and how possibly could be useful to specifically analyze the situation currently in Georgia and the issue of polarization or affective polarization, as I understood, has been mainly worded. So the let's see, yes. About the evolution of the concept. So just a quick introduction. The concept comes from Western liberal philosophy. You know, we have different thinkers, among the others, one from the Netherlands, Hugo Grotius, in 1625. The whole idea behind this original philosophical thinking was that of basically addressing an issue like the creation of political community. So the purpose being that, I think, also going against the cruel laws of nature, and especially those of the mercantilistic era, so where the law of the strongest would prevail. So already in 1600, there was initial thinking in terms of how can we introduce some sort of agreements, regulations that will bring us towards a creation of political community. I think this brief historical introduction is necessary because, as we see almost 400 years later, in the beginning of the year 2000, there is a growing interest from the international community to the concept of the social contract when applied to issues of fragility and political crisis or conflict. But initially, the social contract is not there yet. As you may know, probably the international community, especially in the rhetorics about state building, tended to focus mainly on the formal state institutions, and it was very much a state-centered kind of approach. During the years, they understood that what the missing link was there was the fact that you could have on paper perfect formal institutions at the state level, but then if you couldn't create a connection with society, often these structures would not function or would implode. And of course, the most striking example is the Arab Spring of 2011, what followed from that. So states that seem to have a kind of equilibrium, because this is another of the key words that keep coming back when talking about the social contract, finally imploded. So there were certain things that had escaped many people in the international community. And that's when this increasing focus on state-society relations came. Again, following from that, state-society relations were not just left to formal regulations. There were principles attached to that. Some may call it a normative approach, but if we stay within the realm of open democratic systems, it also started to become increasingly clear that there were some issues of inclusion, inclusiveness, and participation that always needed to be there when talking about state-society relations and about a social contract. So again, participation is a recurring word, is a recurring principle when you talk about the social contract, and we will come back to that later. As a final note, also should be referred to the UN increasing attention to this theme of the social contract. As you may know, the report of the Secretary General in 2021 about our common agenda specifically indicated the need to return to a reviewed social contract. So that's when in the international realm, this debate and this narrative started to evolve. I'm just quickly referring to this image that comes from a UNDP report of 2012, Governance for Peace. I'm showing it because there are, there is specific reference that's, let's say, within the UN family. UNDP is the agencies that started first to work around the concept of the social contract. And what you see on this figure is basically they placed the still not better defined concept of the social contract in the middle. And then they looked at three processes that needed to strengthen, support it, as very important to the creation of social contract. And these are also things that will be coming back when discussing about the issue of the social contract. So we are talking about the need to support responsive institutions, to foster inclusive politics, and again, to strengthen resilient societies. The external circle about partnership is something that was relevant, of course, in the international community. So what kind of partnership can be fostered there, both at the international level and at the national and subnational level, to pursue this objective of the social contract. Now, to go to the definition of the social contract, I'm giving you here a very short one, which is, I think, quite straightforward. It's defined as a dynamic agreement between state and society on their mutual roles and responsibilities. This is a very generic and immediate definition. There are, of course, many different ways of looking at a social contract. This is quite limitative, if I can say so, because, of course, it speaks about the state and a society. Now, when unpacking the definition, the concept of a social contract, we can always say that there can be multiple social contracts in a given society. Not necessarily is the state the only power holder. So social contract can also be sub-social contract with sub-national governance structures. But in generic terms, I think normally when we speak about social contract, we understand a relation between society and the state as a national institution. Here I'm bringing another definition that was developed also through work with UNDP in 2016. I will not read the old definition to you, but the first sentence, and we go back to the initial thinking of Rousseau about the political community. So the social contract refers to processes by which members of political community either explicitly or tacitly consent to state authority. So there is this issue of a sort of bargaining. So they limit some of their freedoms, and in exchange, the states provide protection and security and an adequate provision of goods and services. Now, protection and security is an important issue for us because it goes straight to the heart of security and rule of law, which is a major item that accumulates us here in this session. Going further with the definition, it refers to, again, open democratic systems. As I was saying, social contract can exist in very different forms and situations, but there has been a sort of normative approach to social contract. So we are actually interested in social contract in open democratic systems. And so what do we need to find there? It's meaningful participation, again, of all citizens in the political decision-making processes. Then the validity and legitimacy of the social contract can be measured by the extent to which it creates and maintains an equilibrium between society expectation and obligations and those of state authorities and institutions. And everything is constantly in flux. So again, the equilibrium, so it's a dynamic process, it's a dynamic agreement, and the equilibrium factor is always there. Now, I was talking about different kinds of social contract. Normally we are talking about the inclusive social contract as being the normative standard, but literature and reality also identify and highlight the existence of extractive social contract, for example. There can be a social contract where specific groups have managed to reach an agreement with the state and engage in extractive activities still because they hold
you have 1 minute left, Marco.
Power.
Sorry to stop you.
Okay. Then it would still be a functioning social contract, but it would be a social contract of an extractive nature. Now, this is one of the first figures that were produced in those years to try to show how a social contract, actually the kind of dynamics it implies. It's not probably that clear in a few seconds, but the arrows basically indicate the sort of exchanges between the state on the left side and the population on the right side. So there is provision of goods, services, protection from the state. In exchange, the state wants, I'm not saying submission, but wants endorsement. Of course, taxes plays an important role, and it basically legitimation. So, they want its legitimacy recognized. This is I would say, a better figure, more evolved, produced by the German Institute for Development 2021, so 2 years old. And it gives you, sort of clearer image of the flow. So from left to right, goes from state to society, and it talks about protection, provision, and participation as those fundamental components that the state should offer to the population. In exchange, the populations would have to engage in recognition of legitimacies and other obligations like taxes. Now, just one note is about the fact, again, that in a given country, in a given society, there is not only a social contract. So here the picture gets even more complex because societal groups can have specific social contract with the central authority. So we have to be careful when talking about a social contract. There could be multiple social contracts, but of course there are issues where the social contract need to be of a national nature, and in that case, societal groups need to come together. And if you look at this picture on the right hand, there is a column that talks about social covenants and social cohesion, and especially social cohesion is very important, as you will see later, because it keeps the fabrics of societies together, and it can indeed allow for engagement with the state. Now, this is my last slide for this introduction. The link to polarization, as I see it, well, first of all, social contract has an inherent risk of polarization because it's about bargaining, negotiation. So when certain groups harden this bargaining, there is a risk that they may go to the extremes. So when positions go to the extremes in a sort of spectrum, ideological, political, whatever spectrum, then there we get to polarization. So in the negotiations for a social contract, there is always this intrinsic risk, and something we have to keep into consideration. As a second point, polarization is important because polarization, generally speaking, tends to signal or happen a process of social and political change in society. So when polarization emerges, it always means that we have an issue with the equilibrium of the social contract. So the equilibrium is probably being disrupted. And so it's important to understand, again, the centrality of polarization in this case, and also to understand that something might have been broken in the way that citizens, the population looks at the state. Because of polarization, there will be discontent, at least in half of the population, so to speak. So there is an important link between the two things. Another important effect of polarization on the social contract is the impact that it can have on social cohesion. As I was saying before, social cohesion is an important ingredient of the social contract. It's the fabric of society and needs to stay together, and it's mainly based on trust, solidarity, collaboration, you name it, but all things that under a polarization situation tend to fall apart. So there is a big impact also in there from the perspective of the social contract. As a final point, then I close, when we are facing this issue of polarization from a social contract perspective, we have to go back to the original and the central mission of the social contract, which is that of creating inclusive, participatory, collective processes of state-society relations. So we have to get out of that sort of disruptive and fragmented picture of society. And that's, I think, where the social contract can play an important role, because it's about a global, a collective vision for the country and for its future. And Amy, I think I'll stop here. I hope it was not too rushed, but always happy to come back to some of these points during the conversation. I mean, the general discussion.
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting, a good frame there. I think we won't open the floor for questions just yet, but perhaps we can keep that idea in the back of our minds about relationships between the state and citizens while we listen to our two experts from Georgia. Can I give the floor to you, Corneli, for your input?
Thank you, Amy. It was very interesting introduction, and actually I can maybe start with that actually one of the biggest problems with Georgia's situation is that we don't have really the social contract between political parties and citizens, and even between state and citizens. So maybe we should actually start from that point. But when we talk about the Georgia's part of the polarization, it's very kind of strange terminology, because I don't even know, as we discussed with Amy a few more weeks ago, should we call it polarization or what is exactly what we have it. So I have two suggestions actually. One, I would and then I will have also argument why I'm thinking so. First alternative could be radicalization of Georgian politics. I think this is what is happening, and this is not a polarization. And another one, which was coined by Lincoln Mitchell, who is actually a specialist on Georgian politics, who actually calls it, extreme partisanship, what is going on in Georgian politics. So basically, one of the arguments, and there are a few publications which support this, and I think it was already distributed also among the panelists, was done a few years ago with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, and together with several organizations, including CRC, where they asked actually Georgian citizens, GD, Georgian Dream, the ruling party supporters, and UNM, the main opposition political parties, the supporters, to identify some issues, where they disagree and agree. And as we see from this result, most of the, issues, they actually agree. So it means that we don't have this polarization as societal basis. Basically, this is the elite political polarization, if we can call it again polarization, because it is driven by basically two personalities, former President Saakashvili, and then the Georgian tycoon who is behind other sense, former Prime Minister, Ivanishvili. So basically, just imagine if you remove these two persons from Georgian politics, and if you try to institutionalize Georgian politics, then things may go a little bit different. And also, another thing is that the roots of radicalization of Georgian politics is quite deep. It's nothing something like very new. This is actually, you can even trace this during the centuries, but we can start actually from 1991, when Georgia actually had a civil war in the country, and this political radicalization starting from the national liberation movement, it always was. That was the feature of Georgian politics all the time. And one of the feature also of Georgian politics, except radicalization, was that each political leader and political party considers politics as a zero-sum game. They don't really, there's no societal demand. They're not push also, neither from civil society, neither from media, for consensus-based politics, because consensus basically, or agree with somebody, means you are weak. So this is a kind of the particular kind of understanding we have in Georgian politics. Of course, we also have not only this polarization among the political parties, but we also have the same among media, because most of the media are unfortunately affiliated with political parties, opposition or government. So sometimes they're owned by political party leaders, formally or informally. So they are actually not really helping depolarize society, but they actually agents of fueling the polarization. There might be also interesting what's the role of civil society. Unfortunately, civil society potentially could be one of the actors who could actually help both sides, on different poles to to work together, but unfortunately, civil society is not able to do, and sometimes even civil society is part of this polarized discourses. So that puts Georgia a little bit really in awkward situation, especially now after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because now what we see that things are a little bit changing. Now what we see, I would maybe use here the new word, which is called managed polarization. And before I explain what is this, what I mean here is maybe we should also a little bit highlight the certain feature of Georgian political parties, and because one of the problem in Georgian party politics was that last 2-3 decades, Georgian party politics actually didn't really go and didn't really much use the social cleavages in the country. So far what we have few cleavages which political parties using. These are the pro-Western and pro-Russian, and these are the cleavages which is kind of working. Now there's a new trend which is just emerging. This is another cleavages, kind of liberal versus conservative, whatever the conservative means in this terminology. But there are other cleavages in other, Western societies, which are actually underused by political parties. So that's one of the reasons why Georgian political parties don't have so much trust. They don't have a links to the public, and they don't really represent the political interest or interest groups or social groups. And of course, this also impacts the image of the political parties, because according to many public opinion polls, they don't have enough support. And most of the, voters, they undecided even a few months before. And I think this is also shows the specific problems of Georgian politics. So to get back to this managed polarization, now what we see after Ukraine war, the Georgian government, which is actually just now emerging with this new kind of authoritarian, leadership, and basically they trying now to bring, they use some sort of, I would say, conservative populist rhetorics, pretty much like Orban is misusing it inside Hungary. And they actually try to bring this, I would say, this fake polarization, basically, where they want to split the society in different parts. For instance, they say that, we want to keep the peace, and all other opposition civil society, media, they want, they're just like warmongers. And then they say that, yeah, we are responsible actors. We don't want the war with Russia, but, the opposition and West, especially European Union, United States, want to drag Georgia into the war. And then there's some other, rhetorics, populist rhetorics, which they using in order to entertain, to get some support from Georgian, voters. Don't forget that we have election in 1 year, and this is a party which actually wants to get re-elected 4 times, which is actually unseen in Georgian history. And I think this is also one of the reasons which why they trying to use this kind of rhetoric, because the Georgian society is still social conservative, and the Georgian dream pretty much was always depending on this part of the society. And now they're trying to somehow to play with this part of the society to have some sort of guarantees to get re-elected. Of course, I think this is just kind of our personal impression. We need a little bit more research on this. Maybe there are some other features of whatever we call the Georgian polarization, but I think these are the kind of, the future we see almost like daily basis. And unfortunately, this affects every piece of Georgia, Georgia's democratization, Georgia's Europeanization, Georgia's even, as you know, Georgia didn't get a candidate status last year, unlike Ukraine and Moldova, which was very painful for many Georgians. And I think, and as you know, European Union also came up with 12 recommendations, and one of the 2 of them actually quite linked to our topic. One is the depolarization, and another de-oligarchization. I think that all other 10 can be actually fulfilled until the end of the year, but I'm not sure about depolarization, de-oligarchization, because they have no clear understanding what is exactly the oligarchization or depolarization means, especially in Georgian context we have now. I think I'll stop here for this point, and then I'll be more than happy to continue this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting introduction. I'm also not going to open the floor for questions now. I think we should just go straight to Levan, and then we can have a larger discussion afterwards. Levan, the floor is yours.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you, Amy. Well, I'll try to be brief and speak directly about my view of what are some factors that influence the degree of polarization in Georgia, which is threatening to tear the social fabric of Georgia, and also whatever social contract remains, which I think is a living thing. It evolves, it changes, and it is affirmed through democratic elections and democratic constitution, I'd say. So this is the first fundamental problem that is the reason both for the polarization, but also for the frugality of social contract in Georgia. And that's the weakness of institutions, the weakness of the parliament, weakness of elections, and weakness of political parties. Now, to speak about political parties, one of the driving factors for polarization is lack of internal democracy. And I will explain why. Because Georgian political parties are top-down institutions, generally organized around certain individuals or wealthy small groups of people, and they do not actually represent the voices, opinions, or interests of constituencies or large parts of the Georgian citizens, even though, of course, many people vote for political parties. Despite that, it is very easy for the opposing forces to personalize and personify political parties and attack them as a political party of Saakashvili, political party of Ivanishvili, political party of this person, political party of that person. Now, that kind of personal, aggressive, radical attacks on political parties would not be productive and effective if political parties were really representing people. Because if political parties would be really representing people, or even members, then it would not be an attractive strategy for the other political parties to attack them as such, as we see it currently today. So lack of internal democracy in political parties is one reason. Another one is, of course, the lack of free and fair elections. I mean, no elections in Georgia have been completely free and fair. And we also know that election observation is very weak. It very often fails to detect and spot irregularities, bribery, intimidation, and other kinds of manipulation that occur before the election day. So when that happens, and when people are left feeling that election results do not really represent the will of the people or the attitudes of the people, then that creates a fertile ground for partisan bickering, boycotting or not boycotting the parliaments, and then again drives this wheel of polarization further. So lack of good elections and lack of good quality election observation that goes beyond the election day creates, additional, more fertile ground for this polarized politics. Now, we must also speak about political tradition of Georgia, because Georgian political system, Georgian political parties evolved from the Soviet Union, or rather from the actions against Soviet Union. So informal independence movement, underground independence movement, etc. And back in those years, being someone who would be uncompromising, who would be radically opposed to someone or somebody, who would be basically fundamentally disposed towards the competitors was the sign of proper politics. That was how you did politics. So Georgian political parties basically evolved, grew out of that kind of radical environment. And we still have that. We still have that. It was understandable at the end of final years of Soviet Union, or even before that, when some of the very few opposition political parties were created underground, independence movements, and few others. Why would they prize being non-compromising, being radical, etc.? Because you had to operate in secret, you had to be silent, you didn't want to cooperate with KGB, etc., etc. But unfortunately, what worked back then to drive this idea of independence further is now producing completely opposing results. We need people who want to be compromising. We need people who can find common language. We need people who can collaborate, who can agree, who can strike deals. But this is a hangover of the Soviet Union that we still have, a Bolshevism, rather. And that manifested itself in the civil war, which started very soon after Georgia regained independence, in conflicts that we weren't able to manage peacefully and resolve or mitigate. And it manifests itself now as well. So that's one reason for that. Another reason, of course, is I'd say the poverty of a political strategy and political thought in Georgia. Polarization is the preferred weapon of political strategy in Georgia. So designate everybody else as enemies, pretend that you are the only one who is the anchor of stability, that offers some kind of a comprehensible worldview, that can guide you through the mess that is everywhere, that you know the truth and everybody else is mistaken or the enemy of the state. So that is the political strategy that has been honed by Georgian political elites for years and years and years. Certainly after 2012, when we are entering a new stage of polarized politics, but also before that as well. We remember Saakashvili's government constantly creating this picture, right, of Shevardnadze's people, and the new people, etc. So this is a part of political strategy, which I think is workable, is okay to a certain extent. But when that reaches the levels of where we are today, that is creating the conditions which can actually result in civil war. Not to speak about being able to resolve political disagreements in a peaceful and decent manners. Political culture, again, taking its roots in this radicalized politics from the Soviet Union and then afterwards crises and conflicts. But Georgian political culture, I think Corneli also touched on this, prizes strong men. They say, okay, if you win, your win must be absolute. And there's no mercy for those who have been defeated. Because you really have to show your strong hand. You really have to show, and this is when people follow. Currently, there's a lot of debate in Georgia when, where is the change coming from? Will there be some kind of a new leader? Will there be some kind of a new party? And when I go to meet people, and we travel a lot to speak to different places across Georgia, the common concern or a common desire, so to say, amongst the people is that we want to see the new leader, right? I don't want to see the new leader. I want to see the leaders that we currently have, with their imperfections and with their mistakes that they recognize, realize, normal people in politics. But this demand to see somebody like Saakashvili or someone else, a charismatic, strong man who can lead the people to a certain victory. The masses of Georgians will move when they see the pendulum has shifted. And that is the problem. We want compromise politics, and we want normal politicians with all their imperfections. A lack of professionalization in Georgia. Of politics, professionalization of politics is a big problem. Politicians are serially failing to come up with new ideas, new candidates, new people, new ways to organize, new ways to mobilize people. And they then tend to rely on ages-old tactics, again, of polarization, radicalization, everybody is an enemy. So the weakness of political tradition, of a democratic political tradition, the weakness of political institutions, and the political culture which emerged after, based on all these factors, these are the primary driving forces for polarization. But these are more objective factors, I would say. But there is also, of course, some more subjective, some more individual aspects. And currently, Georgia is in a stage when I think we are transitioning from one type of polarization to another, and this is where I will stop. In the past several years, we've been caught in this dichotomy of United National Movement versus Georgian Dream, or vice versa, so two parties opposing each other. The pace of the deterioration of Georgian democracy, has been accelerating since 2014, I'd say. So our democracy scores have been falling and falling and falling yearly, or not improving at least, but certainly falling in the last 5 or 6 years. But in the recent year or months, we see a monthly or even weekly and daily deterioration of a political environment, with the ruling party taking steps to usurp power more and more, to capture everything in the state and in political institution, and to install a Russian-styled authoritarianism. So we're transitioning to the state of affairs when it's no longer the two political parties that are opposing and are polarized in their fight against each other. I think now we are in the stage when there is one government that wants to create an autocracy in Georgia and turn Georgia on the Russian orbit, and then the rest of the society. And this is a very different stage. And in March, I believe, the Georgian Dream came to power, offering a renewed social contract. So Saakashvili's social contract was a modern state. Get rid of corruption, public administration reform of the police force, and Georgian public service reform is one of the best, I think, in recent decades internationally. Georgian Dream social contract was, okay, this is all good, but we're going to inject democracy, human rights, and dignity, and we're going to bring it. We're going to build the democracy that will be, praised across Europe. That's what Ivanishvili promised in one of his campaign speeches. We will surprise even Europeans with the quality of our democracy. But in March this year, I think Georgian Dream finally and fundamentally broke the social contract in the eyes of everybody in the country. So the agenda of human rights, the agenda of democracy, the agenda of European integration and NATO integration, they were very high on their agenda when they came to power, is thrown out of the window now. So we are entering a new cycle of a very dangerous cycle, when there is a strong polarization, but it's not only between the two parties anymore. It's between a very well-funded, a very strong, supported by special forces, police, etc., government, and then the rest of us, the people who are relatively loosely organized, very weak political parties on the opposition side, failing media that is unable to articulate proper ideas, issues, but still covers and criticizes the government, which is good. NGOs, a small group of NGOs, I'd say, on the other side. And with a failing foreign agenda, with Georgia being distanced forcefully from the European orbit. Well, that is a completely different state of play for Georgia. I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. So I think what we basically just heard was from Cornelia and Levan a number of issues relating to polarization and the social contract, rather large role of polarized rhetoric and personality politics rather than institutionalized politics, the lack of link between political parties and voters, but also from Levan just now speaking about how the political tradition and culture doesn't feed into the compromise and collaboration that you're looking for. And you finally mentioned there, Levan, that polarization is now growing between the government and the security forces and the people, rather than between different political groups. So first of all, are there any questions from the people in the room to clarify on what these two Georgian speakers have just said, or any additions? Now's your chance.
In the chat that might be worthwhile, or that Nina made some contributions there.
Sorry, Christian, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I said that there were some contributions in the chat, but elsewise, I think not everybody can step in at this level.
I can't view the chat. So if is there anything there that you think we should add to the discussion now? Please go ahead.
Yeah, that was from Nina's side. Nina, would you care to?
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Sure. Thank you for identifying my short comment. First of all, thank you very much. It was really interesting to listen to Levan, to Corneli, and then my small question was to Marco, if you allow me. That was more sarcastic question towards social contract, because I'm asking about the implementation, about the conditions and terms, who is setting conditions and terms for implementation. And my second comment was to Corneli, because he mentioned that we in Georgia have no experience of having any social contract. And then, of course, in my personal point of view, we have the experience of having, even in power right now, a social contract. This is the constitutional agreement between the state of Georgia and the Orthodox Church of Georgia. This is typical social contract. Of course, about another topic and content and the political surrounding, but this is a typical social contract. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Marco, would you like to respond first?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Nina, for your question. Yeah, I think your question goes also a bit to what may come in the rest of this conversation. But the question about implementation of the social contract is, of course, a question that has been key to a lot of the work that has been done around this concept. And I'm talking mainly about the United Nations, because these are the ones that, from a policy support perspective, are the ones that have been most active. And I think the question has always been there, and I don't think they're really resolved. Why they got into this conversation about the social contract more than 10 years ago, I think it's precisely because they wanted still to maintain a kind of normative approach, so to show the way to countries that had problems in getting out of fragility or had issues with political instability, with conflict. I also worked a lot on peace building and conflict, and one of the issues also that of why a lot of the peace agreements do not stick, as we say. So what are the things that we do not look enough at? So they wanted to be able to discuss about these issues, but without really pointing the fingers always to state authorities, which for the UN is always a problematic thing to do. So the concept of the social contract gave them a kind of escape, in the sense that they could also show that if you exclude societal groups, people, in the long term, this exclusion is going to come back to you. So one way or the other. It doesn't necessarily have to be in terms of political violence, but this dynamic agreement, as we also heard from Levan and Corneli, is weaker in its essence. So I think this was the sort of hidden message that the UN was trying to promote when talking about the social contract. At the same time, they also couldn't get out of this riddle of, fine, we have a concept where more or less everybody can agree with, but how do we implemented? How do we operationalize? Which is, I think, again, this question coming back in the second part of this discussion. And I think that they are still struggling. I mean, a lot of UN agencies I've also been in touch with are still struggling. And this is a bit it's a tough question. And in terms also because going back to the other part of the question, who is setting the conditions for the implementation? I would also say who's defining what the social contract should look like. So what are the groups, the power holders that define what the right social contract is? And this is precisely what is problematic. So without really hiding anything, the social contract is defined by those that agree on the terms of the contract. So if you have an authoritarian society that can keep the majority of its people happy, sufficiently happy, there you have a social contract. It may not be the perfect one, but you have a social contract. The point is, how sustainable is it in the long term? And I think that's the key question. So are you, again, implementing exclusion in the social contract is not going to undermine the stability and the future of your country. And I think this is something that, again, power holders, those in power need to consider. And this is the whole narrative around this issue of the social contract. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy with the
I hope that
response.
answers your question. Corneli, perhaps you could also respond?
Yes, I think, as Marco mentioned, I think it's very difficult to define, what is the social contract and who will, how is it to define it? The same thing about this case, which was mentioned here. I'm not sure this top-down approach, which was the case in Georgia when actually state under the President Shevardnadze actually accepted this autokephali, that was the social contract as such, because it was not demand as such from the bottom up. So I think it was a little bit more, like when political regimes, they try to accommodate, influential actors like Georgian Orthodox Church, and it was the case with all Georgian governments, starting with Shevardnadze, and then Saakashvili, and then this government. So I think I'm not sure if we can call this, that way. But anyway, where we fail is that one of the huge problem in Georgia is that we don't have the issue-based politics. And if you don't have issue-based politics, of course, political parties, civil society, they are not connected to society. And just look to the public opinion polls in Georgia. We already know last 10, 15 years, what the public opinion actually wants and what they want to hear. And if you listen to Georgian television, they're not going to talk about this issue. They're talking about something else. And I think this disconnect actually doesn't really, doesn't really helps to create some sort of social contract, because simply political parties, civil society, we are not listening to the people. People want, they have their own problems. And I don't buy this argument that some Georgian political leaders say that people doesn't know what they want. It's not true. Everybody wants to know exactly. But the problem is that political parties, civil society, other actors, media, they have to act according to the public needs. And I think we are not there yet.
Thank you. Okay, so if there's no other questions, Christian, is there anything else in the chat? Okay, so if there's no other questions at this time, I think the idea is now that we move back to Marco and that he can perhaps talk a little bit more about the social contracts framework and how we can assess this information that we're getting about Georgia. Marco. Is that correct?
Yeah, thank you, Amy. I'll try again to share the screen along that. Hope I get the right one this time. Oh, one slide should be this one. Could you confirm that you just see the slide?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, okay. Briefly, I hope there's only 2 slides, so it should be okay. As I was saying previously in my response to Nina's question, I think the international community has been struggling on how to operationalize this whole concept of the social contract. I think there is a lot of value in there. it's it's a concept that gives you a lot of entry points, but then what do you do with that? And one of the issues that were mainly discussed was in terms of, and I think this could be relevant in any situation, and also in the Georgia case, is okay, this may be my bias as a former researcher, but you tend to say you always start with the analysis. So what you want to do is to have a clear picture of what is there in terms of a social contract. If there is a social contract, there almost always is a kind of social contract. So how do you assess that? And so there has been a need, I think, to start the discussion in terms of developing tools, instruments that would facilitate this kind of analytical effort to understand, to analyze the social contract. So last year with the Knowledge Platform, we started this cooperation, and this is based basically on traditional work in terms of political economy analysis has been around for many years. And again, I'm talking here mainly about the kind of work that has gone into governance assessment, but more generic, kind of political economy analysis of state building, peace building. So this sort of idea falls into the same line. So the basic concept being that of looking at power structures or power dynamics, in this case, in a given society, and see how they impact on the social contract. Now, why would we be doing that? So the question of for whom is this sort of analytical effort? Well, at the end of the day, why are these analyses possibly important for a context where there is a sort of disputed social contract? Is because you want all the stakeholders, all the actors to realize what the shortcomings possibly of a social contract are and what are the avenues for them to re-engage. So if there is exclusion within a given society, you need to identify who's being excluded and also the reasons. Who are those that are excluding minorities or groups with less power, and so address the issue. So I guess, the analysis can offer a lot in that respect. And of course, it's an instrument that also the international community likes to use because it shows somehow a way, an entry point in how to support processes that would strengthen a social contract. So the way that we have proceeded in operationalizing the concept in terms of analysis, again, inspired by this work on political economy analysis previously, and it basically moves along three different levels of analysis. And as I was listening to Cornelia and to Levan, a lot of the things they said were actually resonating in terms of where would they fit if you apply this analytical framework. Well, the three levels of analysis are, so to speak, quite easy to resume. So there is a clustering of issue, and the first level would basically look at the foundational factors. So basically, these are things that determine a social contract in a country, but where normally you would have problems in trying to change anything. It's about the political historical context. So what I think Levan was talking about, political tradition, these are things that are very difficult to change in the shorter term. But it's important to know that they are there precisely because of the reason he was mentioning, for example, what kind of impact they have in the way society is behaving, whether it's polarization or radicalization, or you want to call it. But there is always something there that has historical roots that is very important. The second level of the analytical framework looks more at the, so to speak, the rules of the game. So the specificity of a social contract in the point in time. And these are more processes where there is more space to intervene. And for example, some of the clusters, the thematic clusters, look at state-society relations, at the political system, and state capacities to deliver on their promises to, protection, security, and services, on economic opportunities for which groups within society, freedom of expression. So these are more trends also. These are more entry points where it's possible to do something. And then the latest group is probably less relevant, but it's the here and now, so to speak. So you basically look at specific issues that are playing a role in that moment. And the most classic example is that of elections, as it was being said. So what kind of impact elections that will take place in 6 months and a year will probably have on the social contract in the country. So this is a way that we've been trying to operationalize a bit this concept, which means basically what kind of analysis can you do around the social contract? And again, it's not measuring, but it's sort of assessment of the social contract. Now, if we go then further in terms of using this analysis, then I think I would like to raise 3 questions based on this point. And I think the first important questions is indeed that of trying to understand what the effect of elite polarization, which I understand is the main issue in Georgia, although again it may be called differently, but the sort of divisions that are being structured within society are mainly associated with elite discourse within the country. So an important question I would say that would need to be answered is, what is the effect of this polarization on the rest of society and on the social contract? And that's because state and elite are per definition bound to various segments of society. So although they act at times in authoritarian way, there are always segments, groups in society to which they are connected. And so it's important to look at disconnections, those that are not connected, are disconnected, and also look at all the kind of divisions that run through society. At the same time, polarization, of course, introduces also discourse whereby part of society feels entitled not to trust anymore the government in place. So because precisely it hears all the time stories about it's an illegitimate, it's an incapable government, it doesn't deliver. So I think these are important issues to be looked at. Then the second point about what I wanted to make, such an analysis would ideally also help to identify what kind of scope, because there is always scope, of course, to do something, but what kind of scope do we have for collective action? Because that's what you need. You need to bring people together to build coalitions and bring people around. And this is basically the essence of politics. So I think the analysis has the potential also to show the way in this respect in terms of collective actions. And in the same way, I think then, if you proceed with a sort of theory of change, so you can work backward and look at what kind of actions of policy interventions are probably the most prioritarian one, the ones that you would probably start first with, whether because they are so-called low-hanging fruit or because they something really needs to happen there. So again, this is just a few suggestions in terms of how an analysis that try to make this concept of social contract more usable, more implementable, could actually help people involved in this issue of the social contract to address some of the issues. And again, it may be, you may end up focusing on a specific societal group, like I did recently in Pakistan, focusing on the youth and how they feel they fit in the social contract or not at all, and what are the main issues that they're facing. Or you could focus on a thematic area. But, I think there is a lot of possibilities there to implement this sort of analytical lens. And I'll stop here, and if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Marco. So I think what Marco's done there is frame this quite nicely with his 3 final questions that can set us up for the discussion that we want to have now. So perhaps I can ask Levan and Cornélie to respond first. How do you feel about this first question? Or what is the effect of this elite polarization or elite partisanship that we've been talking about on society and on social contracts? Could you give us your views? Levan, perhaps?
Well, thank you. I think one of the many effects, but one of the effects is, well, maybe two that I can mention now. Number one is, degradation of political discourse. Now, in this political environment, when parties try to portray everybody else as the enemy and themselves as like having the monopoly on truth, and everyone else, betraying the nation, etc., etc. In order to persuade the public this is indeed the case, you have to extremely simplify your narrative. Come up with some kind of very simple, very primitive cliches, names, tags, and use them repeatedly and repeatedly. And that basically sucks out entire content from politics. This is where Georgian politics is right now. So when the government had come up with some kind of a global conspiracy theory, that there is a global war party that was to drag Georgia into war, that's in the shadow of Russian invasion, that there are foreign agents in the country, Cornelia and myself and a few others I see also here, that are conspiring with those forces, and that, then what happens is that we don't talk anymore about how to fix our healthcare, how to fulfill the criteria for EU membership, how to reform education, etc., because our minds are constantly busy with really thinking about these crazy things, the global war party or the enemies of the state, some kind of attempts to destroy Georgian identity and so on. So that's one effect of this elite polarization, that we focus around these simplified narratives and are no longer having a critical but civilized debate in the country anymore.
Thank you.
Another effect,
Sorry, go
one
on.
is political desocialization. Basically, political parties, one of the key functions that they perform in a society is that they create mechanisms for political socialization. There are different kind of people who don't know each other very well, but maybe share some ideas, beliefs, etc. So we meet, we talk, we come up with agendas, programs, etc. But also they negotiate with other political party representatives with whom we disagree, but we also share the basic assumptions about democracy and human rights, and the rest we can discuss. This is not happening anymore as well. So we are now divided into these military tribes, political military tribes, and just fighting each other to death. So these are the two very, very dangerous results of this kind of polarization that we're witnessing.
Thank you. Cornelia, would you like to add?
Yes, actually, there's a 2 points. For one, how it affects the internal politics and democracy, and another, the foreign policy. In internal democracy, this affects immensely because basically Georgia, as you know, is an emerging democracy. It's not a consolidated one, but within this kind of polarization, there's no chance that Georgia can have stable government. But at the same time, public opinion, actually, if you look to the public opinion actually supports more kind of coalition government. I think public grows a little bit faster than political leaders and parties. But then there's no attitude from political parties that there are no signs that they actually understand this, and that everybody talks about this coalition government, but at the same time, we are champions. When we say we Georgians, we are champions in, ruining the bridges or burning the bridges. And this is the case. And I think this affects Georgian democracy and Georgian future and democracy. And also it affects the foreign policy because, one of the reasons why Georgia didn't get candidate status is not because, Georgia has not done many other things like in terms of association agreement, but it was exactly this, rhetoric which comes from authoritarian government, basically. This is also a little bit based on this value-based foreign policy where Georgia fails. And actually, because of that, it may be the worst-case scenario. Georgia may be will not be able to use this window of opportunity, which was just opened after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think that will be very unfortunate because, this kind of opportunity we only have maybe once during 20 years. And if Georgia will not show consolidation internally and just, always depends on external factors or external actors, I don't think that we can have a, mature society there. And this is the last point is that another huge problem also is that Georgian political parties and leaders, they always think that somebody else, it's the European Union, United States, they have to come and they have to clean the mess which they created. And I think there's a less and less appetite in Brussels as well as in Washington to do so. So I think that what we need is we need to push the Georgian political leaders to behave a little bit responsibly, and they should meet the the demands of this society, which is not the case yet.
Thank you very much. Very interesting points. I heard there degradation of political discourse, political desocialization, this burning of bridges in internal democracy, and the foreign, impact on foreign policy and the inability to make use possibly of this opportunity joining the EU at the moment. So from the other people in the room, are there any questions or additions that you would like to make at this point? Marco, also feel free to jump in if you. It's always very silent online when nobody says anything. It's much worse than when you're in the room together. All right, Christian, you have a question.
Oh yeah, I have a party starter maybe because yeah, there seems to be some room for a third way, as I understand it, right? In terms of that there's some consensus among the population on what on more coalition kind of based politics. But then, that is not represented in the kind of more elite politics. So I'm wondering, also as we serve, let's say, an international audience, how to play into that as international actors that work with NGOs or more on the diplomatic side, without also further feeding maybe into that narrative of foreign agents that are working on Georgia to create their ideal of a state. So that's something I was curious about.
Levon, sorry, was that you raising your hand? I saw you move.
No,
if it wasn't, then it is. Here, you can.
Anyway. Okay, there was a little interruption, but if I understood correctly, it was about what the international community could do.
So I think the point was to begin with, Christian noted that there's a bit of possibly a third option here where you do have a society that's actually interested in something else than that your government perhaps is moving towards, and how we can possibly view that from an international perspective.
Well, a number of things. To begin with, I think, I think generally Georgian society is, despite all the current issues, is pro-democratic. I mean, that's the part, and anti-Russian imperialist. That's how Georgian identity, modern political identity, has been forged. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and Georgians, the first encounter at the end of the Soviet was in the 9th of April when Russian soldiers butchered peaceful demonstrators in the streets of Georgia. So, Georgians will not take it very lightly. This Russian focus on foreign policy. So the problem is political organization and political mobilization. And from the international perspective, I think the international democracy stakeholders, let's say so, for Georgia on the international side, should acknowledge that business as usual cannot continue on democracy support in Georgia. It must be clearly acknowledged, if it is not yet, that we have an anti-democratic, anti-European government in place. Say what people say, but that is the fundamental truth about the nature of the current government. So what with the Georgian, pro-democracy organizations and civil society groups need is more political support to countering that. Now we are now in the phase when we will see more restrictions, more attacks, more harassment, and maybe even banning of in some way of foreign support to NGOs, foreign support to the independent media. So that must be preempted either by front-loading key NGOs with necessary support that they can continue working, even if some restricted legislation introduced to Georgia. And then punishing anti-democratic behavior. I know the wills of European democracy or even American are pretty slow in that regard, but we clearly have people here who are physically attacking students, physically harassing conferences, political gatherings, etc. These people must be punished for that. I don't know, through some kind of a sanctions regime that can be designed. So by both supporting pro-democracy forces in Georgia, but also working to punish those who are actually acting against the will of the people. I think both are legitimate goals that can be pursued from the international perspective.
Thank you. Cornelia, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just it depends. What does international actors want to achieve in Georgia? If most of the donors or international actors I know, they want quick fix. Like overnight, just suddenly Georgians have to change political culture. That's not going to happen. That's a part of political culture, as it was mentioned here. And for this, you need kind of like deeper involvement and a little bit more time, patience, because even if this government will lose the power, this is not going to be the solution, because I can tell you, after 5 years, just let's see if we have scenario that this government is gone and we have new government. Believe me that after 5 years, we will have this kind of conferences again talking about the authoritarianism in Georgia, because one of the reasons, this is a systemic problem. It's not just about personalities. I'm not sure that whoever will come to power next time, they are more democratic and like more liberal than we have the government now. So I think that one of the huge problems also with Georgia is that we had different style of leaders. We had charismatic leaders, we had authoritarian reformers, but we never had a democratic leader. And Georgian politics is actually not designed that way, starting from 90s. So unless there will be change and mental change and institutional change of that, where actually international actors can help, I don't see that there will be any breakthrough, because we can have, we can defeat this government, we can have again new government, but believe me, this is just, we just making these vicious circles. Last 30 years, we always have this problem. And another one, which is was also mentioned by Devan, but to continue with, which is also part of culture, and we mentioned it in our recent article recently, this is we have this so-called, what I call unwritten rule of vendetta in Georgian government. Just look how this government treating Saakashvili, how Saakashvili was treating the Shevardnadze's officials, and how Shevardnadze's officials treated Gamsakhourdias. So we never had a democratic, change of the government, really, even though after 2012, we thought that was the kind of, that kind of case, but we never had. So I think unless there will be change of the culture, political culture, again, this is not going to be overnight. It needs a lot of investment, patience from international community. I don't think that we will have any bigger change, especially this is important now, as Georgia is, now in the middle of this Europeanization, and more Georgia goes towards Europe, Georgia needs more consensus-based politics, and I think there's a role for international actors here.
Thank you. So, are there any more comments from the people in the room? I'm not sure who is actually here, but David, are you maybe here?
Yes,
see whether I can drag anybody into this. So how do you feel about these comments that are being made about, the effect of elite polarization and possibly more generally these international responses?
First of all, thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. It is really, really enlightening.
Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. You see, as our presenters know, the mandate of my work is more less related to politics per se, but more election related. And I can only speak about the implications which are related to generally electoral work, and mostly none going on because of the polarized situation currently. In terms of impacts, well, the impact is lack of cooperation, lack of coordination, and basically lack of the mutual result that one can achieve for the greater good. In terms of strategies to fight against polarization, there are numerous, which was kindly, a number of them were kindly listed by the presenters. But again, it should be seen in a greater picture, if I may say so. It is what actually, again, the society's demand or request is in this case, and what do we do? Is Georgia ready to make these changes? Or we are expecting these changes to come on its own, but basically everything is related to the concrete and specific political conjuncture at the current moment, awaiting for the decision about the accession to the to receive the candidacy whatsoever. So basically, as was mentioned, this kind of discussion may be repeated sometime afterwards, because all or many things will be related and depending on what decisions will be made and what will be additional conditions, perhaps, if they appear. So I'm pretty much into looking forward to continuing these discussions in the future.
Thank you. So perhaps it's a good way to move on to the next question that Marco introduced, and that was namely what the scope for collective action is in Georgia at this point. We were talking about, what society is willing to demand, and what they can demand, and what they're willing to push for at this point. Would either of the speakers like to respond or reflect on that for a moment?
Maybe I'll start here. I think, as I said, public opinion poll shows that, Georgian people wants to see more institutionalized politics, and they want more like issue-based politics, which they want to hear. But unfortunately, there's a demand side, but there's no, another side that cannot really provide this. So I think, for instance, one of the program we're dealing now, GIP is doing to work with the political parties, basically kind of helping them. It's of course much easier to criticize political parties, and I'm sure we have done this many years, and the one was involved for many years helping with the Georgian political parties. We just started this last year working with youth groups. This year we're working with women. So basically we're trying to push them to connect them to the voters, just to hear what they want to hear. For instance, like this year we had a conference, and now we have this women leaders from 11 political parties, basically, who are going to go to the fields, and especially to the areas where they lost the election. And we're trying to help them to talk, to get interviews, basically what the people want to hear. That in order, and then they will produce this document, which was last year. We have this on our website. We have done similar on the youth level, and there was a document which was coined together with 10 political parties, including Georgian Dream in UNM. That was historical. It's not possible anymore. UNM and GD, they don't sit together, but we manage it on the youth level. So this year, basically main kind of the idea of this document was that 10 political parties, they managed on the youth level to develop document and 10 messages what the Georgian voters want to hear from Georgian political parties. Now we want to do the same thing with the women, because almost like 52% of the voters are women. But at the same time, as I said, because Georgian political parties, they don't use the cleavages, they don't really know, or most of them, they have never worked and exactly, because it's not just enough to identify somebody as a, like a woman voter. They have their own, interest, and you need to dig down and exactly to meet this kind of demands. And we're just pushing now to do this. But I think there's a huge work. It's just not youth and women. There's some other issues which they need. But one of the huge problem, and maybe Levan can continue on this here, is that I don't see there's a intellectual capacity in Georgian political parties anymore who could do this kind of stuff. Like they don't have, I don't know, I don't know any professor of economics or a professor of political science or sociologist or somebody who is a member of these political parties, or who can really think, who can bring this kind of ideas. Or there's also financial institutional capability, some other things, but I think these all are basically a huge problem from party side.
Thank you. There was a direct question for you, Levan, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. No, I think, well, the scope of action is pretty wide, I'd say, in Georgia. And by that, I mean the issues that if correctly framed, would generate a lot of action in the Georgian society. I mean, there's crisis in every field in Georgia right now, and the government is igniting a crisis after crisis each day in Georgia. So you have violations of the rights of the minors. They are currently marching in Tbilisi for the protest because of the conditions they work in and the conditions they live in. There are repressions. I mean, and I think there is the proper word for that, political persecution in the entire field of arts and culture in Georgia. People are being fired from museums because the minister doesn't like them or their opinions or the movies they make. They just appointed a former deputy head of the penitentiary system to lead Georgian Cinematographic Center, so that people cannot make the movies that the government doesn't like. And there's I'm not joking. That's real. So there are things happening everywhere. And the failure of political parties to address those issues properly is something that we need to work on. I share Corneli's pessimism there. The immense crisis in education, universities, etc. So you cannot name a field that doesn't require some kind of a political action and a policy action. I share Cornelis' skepticism with regards to the current political elite in the opposition. They are in a disarray, disoriented, and they lack professional discipline to carry out politics and so on. But I think there's a lot of discontent that will need to be positively channeled in the country. And I think two cross-cutting issues that are very, very important to the Georgian society are, again, we're going back to those, the issue of democracy and the issue of Europe. These are very important aspects. These are very important strategic goals. And I think around this, a grand coalition of some sort can emerge. So we'll have to see. I think that leads us to the third question that was asked on how to do that. But
I think the third question would be, what would be the action priorities? But just before we go there, before you jump in, perhaps I can ask Marco just to reflect on this specific question about, what's the scope for collective action? Because both Cornelia and Levan are saying there's no field where there isn't something needed. So how can we look at all these different crises and issues in different policy fields to perhaps zoom in on sort of the collective action aspect of it?
Yeah, of course, I will not speak specifically for the case of Georgia, because as I've told you before, my knowledge is pretty limited. But if I take it as a generic question, well, as a listener, as an external person to the situation in Georgia, I was more worried that both Corneli and Levin would say we are completely stuck. There is nothing anybody can do. But despite them declaring themselves as pessimists, I think they, at the same time, they also said that there is demand from society. So the way I've understood is that, you know, the discourse is controlled by elite, and that's where the fight in the polarization is taking place. And of course, they also influence the public debate, and they have an impact on how people generally perceive their own situation in the country. But there, at the same time, they're saying there is this widespread perception that more is needed in terms of internal democracy in the country. And that actually offers a lot of potential entry points in terms of, you know, where do we start? What kind of issues can we take on? And that's, I think, where, and I know, of course, best than everybody, but I think that's where you can possibly find triggers or entry points. And I think Corneli was interesting, mentioned the work they've been doing on both youth and women in terms of, because again, if you look at the concept of the social contract, I think it's important to have, you know, societal groups to define the kind of social contract that they want. So that's also part of the participation element, I would say. So you need to bring these parts of society into a more generic conversation about the kind of country that they want. Now, I understand in a regime that can be authoritarian, and Levan was talking about political persecution, that may not be easy. But at the same time, there is that sort of widespread need and perception that something needs to be done there. So I'm wondering whether indeed also for external actors, for the international community, there is something that can be potentially supported. And Levan was saying, do it now, because tomorrow, you know, and we've seen that in other countries. I've seen it in Asia and different countries where they started basically almost declaring as illegal any kind of NGO, civil society organization that has any sort of relation with foreign entities or mainly Western entities. So I think this is an important warning. But in the meantime, yeah, to me, their pessimism actually at the same time revealed that there is ferment, there is activity. It's not a completely sort of you know, deaf audience and silenced audience. So I think this raises interesting questions indeed on how then to best engage with that.
So that, I think, thank you for your feedback. I think indeed you summarized it quite nicely about taking back the political discourse, and rather than allowing the extreme political positions to dominate, but actually move more towards what the people, the citizens themselves want. You ended with a question there, Marco, saying, you know, how best to address this issue. And that kind of brings us to our last point about, you know, what actions, what priorities are there? What should we be focusing on first? Is it about, as you mentioned before, you know, the low-hanging fruit, or is there a specific necessity? And then Levan, you brought up the democracy in EU debate. Could you perhaps elaborate a little bit on, you know, why now, why is that the priority over other issues, like you were saying, you know, healthcare or something completely different?
That's for me. I mean, Corneli had a hand up.
Oh, sorry, Corneli.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to say that, of course, the situation is not easy in Georgia, but I think there's no time for what I see now in Brussels is Georgia fatigue. I think what international actors need, they need to think thematically and systematically. I think one of the huge problem which we're facing in Georgia now, if you're Georgian, like citizen now, if you watch Georgian television, opposition television, you think that country is going to collapse today or tomorrow. It's just about to collapse. If you watch pro-governmental television, you think that the country is already much better than some EU member, and country is flourishing. Then you go to third, in the street, and you see third Georgia, which is neither that and neither that. So I think this creates a huge problem, and this also a little bit related to this polarization. Basically, we have, and we had several meetings. Actually, me and Levan attended one of this meeting when political leaders themselves were talking about censorship, in televisions. Just imagine, a political leader from opposition goes to opposition television, and if he or she will not talk about specific talking points, which is, like important for that television, he or she will not be invited there. So I think what Georgia needs really is, even though I don't know how to do that, some sort of independent television, which actually talks, formally, it should be public broadcaster, which is not going to happen, because this public broadcaster is just another hand of the government, unfortunately. But just imagine, we had such a television kind of like Rustavi too before the revolution, which was really, like huge support for public. They were basically, independent and everything. Now we don't have this. We have a lot of partisan television, opposition or governmental or something, but they have their own agendas. So people, like ordinary people, they don't see their agendas there. Just look now, there's a miners' protest in Georgia, and only online media, covers this. Not mainstream media. Most of them, they are very, reluctant to do this. So just imagine if there was a kind of independent television. We have very good independent newspapers, few of them actually, but they cannot reach everywhere. So there's some areas where international community actually can help, like to do several things. But of course, now I don't know how exactly this should be done. But this is just, I just identified one of the problem, which is which creates also problem. And this is very important also for next year, because next year we have election, which will be very important. And as I said, Georgia is at crossroad right now. Nobody really knows where Georgia will lead. Okay, we have optimism about Georgian people because most of them, they support, like EU and NATO membership. But I don't know. We need also to not to depend on this only, but we need to kind of give them some sort of instruments that they can actually vote according to what they believe. And I think this is not a case yet in Georgia.
Thank you. Very interesting. Levan, if you want, would you like to respond or?
Yeah, a couple of things on you asked on why EU and democracy, precisely because both of them are the tools to address these problems that we have in every sector of the country. By democracy, we will open up the space for discussing different issues and resolving those conflicts in more or less like agreeable way based on a consensus or some kind of a legitimate process. And by getting closer to the EU, we will be able to reform those institutions and receive the support that we need. And it's not only material support, it's also, most importantly, knowledge of how to do things. So those two things, and then they also set out clear targets where you want to go, and that some way replaces the shortage of policy ideas. You open up these integration chapters, you have center benchmarks, and that influences very positively your domestic policy agenda as well, and creates a completely different content for a conversation. I've seen the transformation in Moldova, for example, after receiving this candidate status. I know Moldova before and after, and the conversation and political environment is completely different. It's on a different stage. Yes, there are issues, corruption, government. There are many issues with the opposition and also the Russian influence political forces. But there are also different things that people are discussing and setting out different goals, and there's a new agenda in the country. So in that regard, getting closer to the EU also creates a more positive dynamics internally. and people want that. So that's why.
Can I perhaps thank you for that. Can I perhaps ask you a follow-up question as well? Because obviously, if you had a candidate status, that may change the discussion. However, to get that candidate status, you may have to already change the discussion. So how could you possibly push towards that without having the candidacy yet?
Well, again, there's a very difficult problem, and the only way to push that is to force Georgian government to do that. And whether we will be successful in that or not, I don't know, because yeah, in this there are a lot of weaknesses here on the democracy side of Georgia. But ultimately, again, it's up to the Georgian citizens. I mean, if we are able to organize, if we are able to articulate the importance of both democracy and Europe better, and if we are able to mobilize the energy that the Georgian society still has, we've seen that in March, right? We were able to come together, plan that thing strategically, mobilize people, articulate demands that were clear and legitimate, and force the government to withdraw the bill. Well, can we repeat that again? Maybe yes, maybe no, we'll have to see. There are many intangibles that we cannot foresee, but at least we have to try. And there are many things that from the international side will be helpful in that uphill battle. Also here, and we spoke about it a bit already.
Thank you. So I'm just going to ask whether the other people in the room, Jonathan, Natalia, Liliana, whether you have, and I also have somebody called MBO13. I'm not sure, not sure what to call you, but we'll just call you by your name. Is there anything you guys would specifically like to ask or add at this point? Also thinking about, these taking back this social political discourse and what's possible without having joined the EU candidacy status. Just going to leave a slightly longer silence so that people can have a think.
Yeah, or even if you link it to, if you're not very familiar with this context, to link it to maybe the context that you are familiar with, right? This can also sometimes be a refreshing perspective.
Absolutely. We'll just presume they've left the room. They've turned their laptops off and left the room.
I think Jonathan is saying in the chat that there's no questions from him. The others, I don't know.
All right. So perhaps continuing the conversation. Thank you, Levan, for just adding that point. Cornelia, can you also give your reflections on that? How are we going to get this discussion moving without the candidacy?
Yes, actually, this is a very important issue. And since I'm based in Brussels now, I'm on a daily basis actually chasing this kind of issue. So at this moment, there's an issue it's like 50-50. Georgia has a chance, and EU actually is interested in Georgia to give this candidate status. But it's up to the Georgian government and maybe opposition also how to fulfill these 12 points. And I sometimes, and not only it's my impression, but the Georgian government, it seems like Georgian government sometimes doing everything opposite in order not to get this candidate status, and then blame EU that basically it was EU who actually didn't give the candidate status to Georgia. So I think this is a huge risk because don't forget the geopolitical dimension of this issue also. And I think there are some people in the EU, they say that, if Georgian people don't want to get EU membership, then it's up to them, or they have also, chances to next year election, because this is a government which was elected by Georgian people. So if they want EU membership, then they can act accordingly. So there are some people, there's a link between next election, and there are some people actually who don't want to connect with this issue, but this is I would say the major issue. And then if Georgia will not get candidate status, I think this will not help Georgia, because it will pull out Georgia from associated trio, Ukraine and Moldova. So it will be much easier for illiberal forces inside the country to do anything they want to do. And also the more authoritarian Georgia becomes, it will get closer to Russia. And I think this is a scenario which nobody really benefiting, neither EU, neither like Georgian people. So, but again, it's at least what I see out of this 12 point, de-oligarchization and depolarization will be huge issue, and others, we can agree on somehow, but that's why last week we had a delegation of the Georgian government here, including Prime Minister, and they were trying to persuade the EU to take out this de-oligarchization and some other kind of to a bit mitigate this kind of issue. But of course, it doesn't work. It's not about only Georgia, because Georgia should not expect shortcuts from EU. So I think, and there's also talk that nobody, even if you give the candidate status to Georgia, nobody wants to have new Hungary in European Union. And I think that's why, like they basically message from Brussels is that sort out your mess, return back to the reform agenda and act as a responsible democratic actor.
Thank you. Do you think that also offers the space to government to, from a social contracts perspective, to renew this discourse, the way that the government and the citizens speak with each other? And if so, is there space, where should you put the pressure to force the government to do that?
I think pressure should be both ways, internally, that is most important, and externally as well, because I don't think that this type of government, who has this authoritarian tendencies, will not just yield the power. And I think what the EU wants is they wanted to push the Georgian governments to share the power with the opposition. That was the main idea of this Charles Michel agreement and everything. But the problem is that, again, the Georgian dream actually is afraid that if they will fulfill these 12 points, they may lose the power. And as Levan mentioned here, our elections are not really fair all the time, and they use a lot of administrative in their resources, some other things. And of course, and one of the major issues which I highlighted in the publication, which I just linked to you, is that again, this vendetta rule, which is still there, because if they lose the power, it's not about like you lose election in Netherlands and you just go home. These people may go to the jail. And including oligarchs. So this is not only about survival of regime. This is physical survival of some of the leaders. So that's why this needs a little bit delicate, handling from EU side and from other international actors. And that's why there should be some sort of internal pressure as well as external thing as well.
All right, thank you. I just see one question or a hand up, at least from Natalia, and then we'll move to rounding up.
Yeah, so thank you. I actually have a question, maybe a little bit on kind of a very basic one. I visited Tbilisi recently, and one thing that I noticed is that on the one hand, yes, there is this kind of divide between the government and what the people want, but on the other hand, I also observed some divisions within society about which way to go. So, and also just kind of common sense tells us that no government really exists without at least some support in the population. So maybe you could speak a little bit more about which groups are exactly more in favor of the current government and what kind of divisions exist in Georgian society. Thank you.
Thank you. Which one of our speakers would like to respond?
Well, I'll try, because I really have to leave at around 4 o'clock.
Keep it nice and short.
Yeah, I'll do. That is changing, but I think right now this is the typical party that relies on state employees and security apparatus, and some hardcore anti-democratic elements. This is the core support group, I'd say. of the Georgian dream. I mean, in Georgia, the government is, I think, #2 employer. If we count also, social services, schools, state institutions, educational institutions, universities, etc., etc. So, in the absence of the rule of law and the independent courts, people who work for the government are very vulnerable. And also in the absence of poverty, widespread poverty, extreme poverty, and so on. So really, you depend for your daily survival on this meager government salary that people are receiving across Georgia. So they will be manipulating that. And also people who benefit materially from the government and really see democratic forces as the enemy. So more like pro-Russia elements. I mean, we've seen also a decline in the support levels of the Georgian dream in the regions, in some key demographics, in big urban centers, in the regions, among women, notably, and among young people. So this is what the government's problem currently is, that they're trying to remedy that very much. So yes, there are divisions, but there are no divisions whether Georgia should be a democratic country or whether Georgia should become a sort of eventually EU member. Even Georgian Dream supporters, traditional, more moderate supporters, which was a large part of it, wanted to have both the GD and Europe and democracy. This is how Georgian Dream came to power in 2012. And that remains an electoral problem of the Georgian Dream right now. And this is why they have this very strong anti-democratic, anti-EU, anti-liberal propaganda, because they see that this is also part of their electorate. So they have to demonize the West and EU, remove that question from the electoral landscape, and just campaign on, against some kind of foreign agents and liberal fascists and global war party. But it's very difficult to do because people are still reading behind the lines. There is still a critical media, there is social media, there is internet, and we can still travel and talk to people, I don't know, to our democracy schools, other things, Corneli's work, other people's work. And this is why the NGOs were attacked in March, and this is why we are also still the target.
Thank you very much, Natalia. I hope that answers your question somewhat. All of a sudden, we're 3 minutes before the end of time. So no big wrap-ups, but thank you all to the speakers. Marco, I saw you taking a number of notes there at the end, so I might call you later just to hear what your feedback was. I'd like to, so firstly, thank you very much to the speakers. I'm just going to hand over to Christian briefly to wrap up. Christian.
Yeah, no, thanks. I'll keep it very short, but because we have a follow-up trajectory, right? This is one, then there will be a second one on Moldova, and then we plan to have, let's say, a policy discussion with, let's say, Dutch level, EU level policymakers with some of the conclusions that we have. So I've been also listening with that perspective in mind on, what kind of openings or recommendations do we see for that audience afterwards. And I think, some conclusions are that maybe polarization in this case might not be the best term even, right? We have discussed a lot this elite competition or maybe one group even taking ownership of the state. And also social contract is quite a difficult term as it's maybe not always demand driven or top down. So at least not reciprocal or ideal as you might call it. And also given the history that there's maybe not a big tradition of the classic kind of social contract. And some openings that I saw that might be worthwhile to follow up discussions on are, this kind of still this support that seems to be there for an alternative, and also the advice to stop for the EU side, let's say, to stop, for example, business as usual and democracy support, but to support a plurality of voices, and also to, on the other hand, punish anti-democratic behavior and even physical intimidation. So I think this kind of forceful change has been a topic that has been coming up repeatedly. Maybe also more in terms of capacity building on coordinating mobilization and to kind of connect all the different problems that are in different sectors, and to kind of help bring also those different discussions into the more public narrative. And support, I thought an interesting one is, and I'm going a bit free here, but for example, support is, the comment that you made was interesting on the dependency on government jobs, and that because we work for the security and rule of law sector. So I think, you know, what you said about justice mechanisms to claim your basic rights and income and protection is a very creative also entry point, I think. But well, I've written a few more down, but we don't have a lot of time. So I want to thank you so much for joining, and we have a feedback form. So we're really interested in what you thought of this, and because we also have some follow-up sessions as well. So please scan the QR code, or there will be a link in the chat to share with us what you thought of it, and was it also the preparations, was it easy to find? Because I saw some people had some trouble with maybe finding the link. So that's also very practical things that we're happy to know about. But mostly, thank you so much, Amy, Levan, Marco, and Corneli for your great contributions. And,
it's a pleasure.
Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot.
And while it's now 1 minute past 2, we were nearly finished on time. All right, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Christian, for your feedback, and we will be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And have a good
Thank you.
afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.